This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist, kicks off today's show with the cattle market update. He discusses fed cattle futures, slaughter cows, and fed cattle closeouts. Continuing the show is K-State Precision Agricultural economist Terry Griffin as he explains the recent GPS outages that people experienced. He says how these issues will likely happen again. Anthony Zukoff, K-State Extension entomologist, ends the show with information about a newer pest, Soybean Gall Midge. He says the damage it does and how it can be identified. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, kicking off our cattle market conversation with looking at fed cattle futures.
Yeah, so the positive thing is that we've had quite the rally this week. It's maybe not have been as sharp as what some people were expecting, but we're able to break some resistance in the June contract back up to almost 181. Really, the big story there was that we were able to get back to prices that we hadn't seen in a long time. How much we break through in the future month, really to be seen. I'm unsure where this market's really going to go and how much we can actually push the futures up. Generally, we see the futures kind of come to meet the cash in the last month rather than the cash come down to meet the futures. And so there could be some improvements there, but given that kind of deviation, I'm interested to see kind of where that market is going to be going. In the deferred months, though, in October, I'd say it's probably more positive. We broke into the 182, almost 182 for the October market, and really that was, if you think back on where last time we were at 182, it was back in April when we had high path and we had a big downturn. So that was really big news. Can see that price continuing to appreciate as we go through the year.
Elliott, then continuing our conversation, talking about slaughter cattle.
Yeah, slaughter cows have been continuing to be an interesting just graph that I continue to look at. It continues to be extremely high, and some of that's driven by other factors outside of our control. But I mean, we're at 113 a hundredweight. Same time last year, we were at $88 a hundredweight. So pretty significant. That trend should continue, which we normally the price appreciates all the way through the summer. If we have that same kind of trend or spacing between where we were last year compared to the previous year, we could easily be in the 125 to 135 range for slaughter cows, which is pretty large, especially when we think about where is that value coming back to the feeder cattle producer. And when you kind of look at what's one of the things that are probably driving that, we look at the cutout value and really that's risen from about 222 last year to 270 this year. That's dollars per hundredweight. And that's well above where we're at, or the 5-year average, which is 190. So really that drive or that pull from the consumer, we think about where that cow goes to. It goes through a lot of lean beef or ground beef. And so just continues to be high demand there. A little bit puzzling that we continue to see strong pull through given that we just had such large harvest weights. So that's definitely been something that I've been watching. And we do have a fewer cows being harvested. That's when we talk about a lot of discussion about, are we expanding the herd or are we not? Well, the primary things that we are watching the last 2 years has been number of cows that have been harvested. And we have seen a break this year on number of cows harvested. Beef cows in particular, we're at about 55,000 head a week, and that's down about 15,000 head a week from the last year. So, I mean, we are killing fewer cows. Same thing, we're killing fewer dairy cows, about 5,000. So that's helping that price appreciate on the slaughter cow. But still incentives out there to harvest, and so producers, feeder cattle producers making that trade-off right now of, do I take that profit now or do I start to rebuild the herd?
Elliott, moving on in our conversation, discussing the choice select spread.
Yeah, so I mean, if we have a lot of conversation has been on what's going to pull this market through. Consumers, it's grilling months. We tend to have high demand for quality steaks. People want to be out on the grill. End of this month with Memorial Day really kicks off the summer as far as grilling. That's kind of bookended by Labor Day. That choice select spread is kind of that premium when we think about, do we put cattle on feed for longer? We have had a lot of cattle that have been on feed for many, many days. And so we have had a lot of choice cattle being harvested. And so that's really narrowed that choice select spread. Currently, we're about $7 a hundredweight on that choice select spread. But we tend to, seasonally improve where we're at on that choice select spread. On average, for the 5-year average and last year, we tend to appreciate till about $20 a hundredweight. I don't think it's going to be that large. I think we're going to be a little bit below that, just because given how many cattle that are still on feed for extremely long times. Now, this trend is really not something new. It's been something that's been happening since the middle of February. And in the middle of February, we basically took an inverse trend. We normally would continue to decrease our cattle weights. And in fact, we actually kind of elbowed and increased our cattle weights up, and then have since really plateaued over the last 6 to 7 weeks. We're at 922 pounds on steers. That was the last data reported by USDA. If we would have followed generally last year and the 5-year trend, we should be somewhere in the 885 or 892 range. So we're, almost 30 to 35 pounds higher per carcass than we were before. So there's a lot more beef on the market, and those cattle have been just on feed for a lot longer than they normally are.
And even though those harvest weights aren't continuing to increase, you mentioned they've plateaued. Do you think they're going to continue to stay at that number, or will they eventually get a little bit lighter?
I think they're going to continue to stay at that plateau for at least the next month or so, just as we work through some of those cattle that are still on feed for a long time. Number of cattle that are on long days is still up. And so those cattle need to be worked through, and then we'll start to work back through. And a lot of that has to do with kind of where we're at on, if we sell the fat cattle, we have to put new feeder cattle in, and those feeder cattle prices are very expensive right now.
Continuing our conversation now, Elliott, talking about fed cattle closeouts.
Yeah, so this is kind of what's been, I thought was kind of interesting and a bit puzzling for me. Obviously, Kansas State has their great focus on feedlot report. Really, what we see there is that they have reduced days on feed. We know we're down from about 3.6 to 3.3 pounds per gain. And our feed conversion, unsurprisingly, have gone up, which means we're doing poor job at converting, it's up from about 6.4 on the 5-year average to about 6.8. So normally you think, okay, they have to feed them to get to that same weight a little bit longer, and that's kind of what we've seen. But unsurprisingly, or surprisingly, those weights on closeouts have not really changed. So you would think that they would be a little bit higher, but in fact, they're killing at pretty much the same weight. So, but the good news is that we're seeing that feed costs kind of come down. It's down from about $145 last year to $125 per hundredweight. So this is kind of that cost. What does it cost to put on weight? But it's still well above where we were at in the 5-year average, which was 90 pounds. And so when we're thinking about harvesting, is there an incentive to keep cattle on feed longer? A lot of that has to do kind of with this relationship with the feeder cattle and the corn price.
Continuing on that thought, Elliott, where is feeder cattle in the corn market at?
Yeah, so in Nebraska, it's very, very high still. I mean, we're at $335 per hundredweight for 5-6 weights. That's above $291 last year, and our 5-year average, which was $182. So I'll repeat that. We're at $335 above our 5-year average at $182. Extremely high right now. And we tend to continue to have price appreciation throughout the summer in preparation for the fall run. I think that where we're at, I don't think we can continue to have that much price appreciation. I think that it should moderate a bit. The similar trend is for our 7-8 weights. We're at $266 a hundredweight. And if we were to continue to have that same price spread between where we were today versus where we were last year, we could be looking at extremely high 7-8 weights at almost 315 a hundredweight for 7-8 weights. So very, very high. Once again, I don't think we're going to reach those, but general trend is that feeder cattle likely into the summer are going to be expensive, which kind of puts that pinch on feedlots. The good thing there is that, corn prices isn't outrageous and distiller prices have come back down. Corn prices are almost at the 5-year average, which is about $4.50 a hundredweight. That price today is pretty similar where it was in the fall when people were buying a lot of that corn or they were cutting silage. So high moisture corn and both corn are priced relatively the same, which means we were able to kind of feed them for similar days. Pretty big news there when we talk about what's kind of the incentive to push feeder cattle forward, though. In the past, we were talking about drought. There was kind of this incentive to kind of move feeder cattle off pasture because it just wasn't there. That's not going to be there this summer, which is going to further tighten the feeder cattle market. All across the U.S., our pasture that's rated poor and very poor is down from last year. That's I guess a good thing for feeder cattle producers. Compared to last year, on average throughout the U.S., we're about 25%. Now we're at about 10 to 12%. So pasture conditions are looking good. We have tight cattle supplies, which would tend to mean that prices would appreciate a little bit. So I don't think they're going to appreciate as much as we think, but definitely exciting times throughout this summer.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Yep, thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show on this Monday talking about space weather with K-State Precision agricultural economist Terry Griffin. Terry, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here again, Shelby.
Terry, talking about space weather today, and why is this something that's really relevant?
So the afternoon of May 10th, 2024, we witnessed GPS outages. And it happened at a time that was very crucial to Kansas farmers as we're in the middle of planting of the summer crops. And it wasn't just Kansas. It was Nebraska, the Dakotas, the Great Plains, the Corn Belt. We had a GPS outage in a larger geographic area than we've had before. So it was very, very relevant. We've had many of our listeners enjoyed seeing the Northern Lights that evening, that Friday evening. I know I did. So our listeners understand that we don't get to see the Northern Lights like this very often. In 1991, November 8th, 1991, I observed a green aurora from northeast Arkansas. I was harvesting rice, and it was a beautiful event. May 10th was the second time I got to see the aurora. So all these events are linked. The solar activity on the sun, caused both of those events on May 10th.
And what solar activity is that causes those events?
Well, it wasn't just one. There were several events that were happening. We're nearing solar max. So many of the listeners may remember when Rebecca Bishop from the Aerospace Corporation sat down with us, and she's an astrophysicist. She's a senior scientist there, and she explained some of the physics behind this. So we had a huge sunspot, and it was naked eye. What I mean by naked eye, we didn't have to zoom in with the telescope. All we needed were eclipse glasses. So Friday morning, May 10th, walked outside, put the eclipse glasses on, and this huge dark area on the sun's surface, which was 16 to 17 times wider than the diameter of the Earth, big. So we had that going on. We had solar flares, coronal mass ejections. There were lots of different activities happening that day, and some of the coronal mass ejections were traveling towards Earth when larger, faster ones came afterwards and overtook the ones that left earlier. So that was let's say a triple whammy. We had lots of things going on with the sun, and these things are expected to occur about every 11 years in history. We expect the number of sunspots to max out, and then they'll start calming down again. These are 11-year cycles. We started measuring this in 1750, and since then this is solar cycle number 25, and it is believed that this should max out in 2025. So it's not just going to be a one-time thing on May 10th, 2024. It could happen rest of the 2024 production season and into the 2025 production season. So their listeners need to be aware that, not only will we may have the opportunity to see the northern lights from Kansas, but we may also have some GPS outages along the way.
How did the combination of these things possibly create an issue for farmers?
So on May 10th, we had a trifecta of things going on. One, we had this huge, intense solar storm that was happening. Two, we had planters rolling full force, middle of planting season across the United States for summer crops. And in 2024, we have more reliance upon GPS than we ever had in history. So even the last solar max 11 years ago, we had fewer acres being planted and harvested with GPS equipment. So we had a trifecta with the intense geomagnetic storm. It was maxed out at the severe G5. We had 70% of all planted acres have a GPS on them for something, and planting was a big part of it. And also had this reliance. And 10 years ago we talked some about farm data, but today we're even more interested in it. So even if many of the planters that expected to use GPS didn't, they were still getting seed in the ground, they were not getting geo-referenced as-applied data. Right? And so if it was fertilizers going out, if it's crop protection chemicals that were being applied, and we don't have as-applied data, then that may limit our ability to do on-farm experimentation with that data after the fact. Getting seed in the ground in May is the primary focus, right? That's mission critical. Secondary is collecting data from those activities. Let's just say we're harvesting corn in Kansas in October. GPS goes out. We can still get the combine down the road, harvest, but logging that yield data from the yield monitor to a geo-reference latitude, longitude won't be happening. So we're going to lose yield maps, which may mean, on-farm experimentation would be disadvantaged. We may have seed sales force interested in getting this information too, so it's not just the farmer within the farm gates that's interested. And, a lot of farmers like to make printed yield maps on mugs for their landowners to keep relations good. And so having a GPS outage during harvest could also have negative aspects just from the data side.
How long were those outages that took place on May 10th, and how could they compare to future ones?
It was hours. Started about 4 p.m. Central Time on Friday afternoon, May 10th. The most recent one, I guess the biggest solar radio burst up until then, happened in December of 2006. And we had radio blackouts. Then GPS there was an outage. But early December, most farm operations are not occurring in Kansas. So we're not planting anything. Hopefully we're not harvesting anything at that time of year. So largely in the agricultural community, it went unnoticed. May 10th, in not just Kansas, but across the Great Plains and the Corn Belt, where planters were rolling hot and heavy, partly due to some areas had lots of rainfall, so they were delayed already, and so planters had to stop. Many planters had to stop. Some planters continued, maybe with crooked rows, wide and narrow middles, foregoing row shutoffs. Some planters still have row markers, so they were unaffected.
We're obviously focusing our conversation towards agriculture, but it did impact things beyond our industry. Yeah,
of course. So GPS, we use it a lot in agriculture. 70% of planted acres in the U.S. uses GPS of some sort somewhere, but anybody that carries a cell phone uses GPS. And so all of society wasn't impacted. And, the aurora, for instance, I think all the European countries reported seeing aurora. Mexico, we have palm trees in Florida with the backdrop of the aurora from Friday night. It wasn't just the Midwest part of the United States. It was a global event. And I was really excited Friday afternoon, May 10th, that aurora images were coming in from Africa, where it was already dark. some southern Africa is facing south, they could see the southern lights. And I was crossing my fingers saying, I hope that it holds out long enough for us to enjoy that here in the United States.
You mentioned that we haven't reached solar max, so what could people be expecting in the future?
As time goes by, I want our listeners, I think I was really proud of watching people on social media on Friday. I kind of lurk around and see how people react. And for the most part, I could tell that everyone knew what was happening. They weren't panicking. And that's my number one recommendation when it comes to radio blackouts is don't panic. Right? So it may be a 5-minute thing. It may be a 2-hour thing. But it's not a local problem. It's not local hardware. And so what we should do is go to the Space Weather Prediction Center website with NOAA. Can we add that to the show notes? So there are several things on here. It's a dashboard, lots of cool information. One of them in particular I check probably way too often is the Planetary K Index. So the Planetary K Index goes from 0 to 9. We hit 9. We were at 9 for several times. We maxed out. When it's at less than 5, the bar chart will be green. So you can just scan it quickly. If the most recent bar is green, it's not a solar activity causing your problem. If the bar is dark orange, red, dark red, it might be solar activity. And if it is, there's nothing that you or your dealer or anyone here on the planet can do about it. So knowing the source of the problem is really important.
For people who are wanting to learn more about this, do you have recommendations for them?
I do. And there's also a lot of misinformation out there on social media and websites. So NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration with the U.S. government, is the one source. And they have the Space Weather Prediction Center, which is in Boulder, Colorado. They recently had their annual event a few weeks ago in early May. That is the primary source of information. There's some good scientists to follow on social media, but for the most part, it's regurgitating the information that's coming from NOAA. But I would find a good, reliable source if you do choose to find a space weather expert to follow.
Terry, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about space weather.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm always interested in coming in and discussing two of my favorite things, agriculture and space weather.
That was K-State Precision Agricultural Economist Terry Griffin. I will link resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net, where you can learn more about this space weather. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about Soybean Gall Midge. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff. Anthony, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Anthony, can you share with us a little bit about what is Soybean Gall Midge?
So Soybean Gall Midge is a relatively new pest of soybean production in the central United States and now Kansas. Actually, 164 counties and 6 states have now had soybean gall midge, and it only started in 2018.
So where in Kansas has this been found?
After several years of Nebraska counties on the Kansas line having infestations, soybean gall midge finally showed up in northeast Kansas and Nemaha and Marshall counties last year. And it was infesting soybeans and yellow sweet clover, which is kind of a common roadside weedy forb.
And why is this something that is concerning to growers in Kansas?
This pest can be pretty devastating. So it's a tiny little fly that lays eggs in the plants, and then their maggots basically consume tissue inside the stems of the plants, and this leads to severe lodging and outright plant death. And it could be quite widespread pretty quickly in the fields that get infested.
And how much damage can it do in terms of yield loss?
Good estimation is, from the field edge, which is where the infestations typically start, to about 100 foot into the field, you could have complete yield loss. So beyond 100 feet up to about 300-400 feet, you could look at about 20% yield loss in that zone. The large infestations can cause significant losses.
And as we're thinking about this, what does the soybean gall midge look like?
A midge is a tiny fly, so soybean gall midges are really small gnat-like flies, just a couple millimeters long. They have a bright orangish body. They have mottled wings, and their legs are striped. The maggots, which would be on the inside of the plant, start out as just kind of a clear, cream-colored little maggots, and as they mature, they become bright, bright orange.
What is the life cycle of a soybean gall midge?
A lot of work is still going into, teasing out all the life history details for this pest. Right now, it's estimated there's at least 2 generations per year. This pest will overwinter in a field, and in the spring, late spring, the adults will emerge from the soil where the pupa had overwintered, and then they'll fly around and look for hosts, and that host is going to be soybean, and they'll lay eggs at the base of the plant, starting about V2. And that's when folks should start scouting their fields, because around that time, that's when natural fissures and cracks will start to appear at the base of the plant stems. And that's how the adult midges get their eggs into the plant. And then so the larva will develop in the plants over a period of several weeks, and more adults will emerge to lay eggs, at least 2 generations, and then they'll overwinter at the end of the season.
What are some things that producers could be doing?
Right now, there's no solid insecticide, foliar treatments recommended. It's a very tricky pest given the long emergence of these adults over time in the field. There are a couple cultural things people can consider. If you have a field that's been infested very heavily, or if you have a field that you want to plant next to a field that was infested last year, you might consider not planting near those fields. You could rotate to a different crop for a season or 2, and that could help reduce the population. And finally, there is some promising work looking at cultural technique of hilling soil at the base of the plants early on in the season. And so what that's doing is preventing the adult midges from actually getting eggs laid in those stems because it's protected by soil. But work for that is ongoing. It might not be very practical for everybody.
How would growers find this in their fields?
You want to get out to those fields, soybean fields around V2, and start looking on the edges of fields for plants that are wilting. Look at the base of the plants. They might have swollen, darkened base of the stems. And so if you see symptoms like that, wilting, weird, brittle, darkened stem bases, take those plants and cut them down the middle and look for maggots inside the stem. And if you do see some maggots, especially if they're bright orange, reach out to your local extension professionals and let us know, because early detection for this pest is really important, as it's likely to continue to expand as in other states over the years. So we just need to be very vigilant in looking for this pest and getting the word out.
That was K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff. I will put resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to learn more about soybean gall midge. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.